Get out now! You people don't belong here! Karen Mitchell jabbed her finger toward the black man swimming in Willowbrook Commons' crystal blue pool. She marched to the water's edge, designer heels striking concrete like gunshots, her HOA president badge gleaming on her blazer. 62-year-old James Washington surfaced at the pool's corner, silver hair dripping. He had been swimming the same disciplined laps for 3 months since moving into Unit 4B. "Ma'am, I live here," James said quietly, his weathered hands gripping the tile. "Liar," Karen spat, stepping closer until she towered directly above him. "I know every single person who belongs in this community. You're not one of them." She jabbed 911 on her phone. "I'm calling the police right now. They'll drag you out in handcuffs where you belong." James remained perfectly still in the water, his posture carrying decades of command despite his vulnerable position. Karen's voice turned venomous as she waited for the call to connect. "I hope you're ready for what's coming." She had no idea who she was really talking to. The confrontation at Willowbrook Commons had been building for weeks, though James Washington never imagined it would explode on such a perfect Virginia morning. 3 months earlier, he had signed the lease for Unit 4B with the simple hope of finding peace after 4 decades in uniform. The realtor had emphasized the community's exclusivity, its proximity to Quantico, and the promise of quiet mornings by the pool. James had chosen this place deliberately. After losing his wife Margaret to cancer the previous winter, he needed somewhere that felt safe, predictable. The military had given him structure for 40 years, and without it, he felt adrift. The morning swim routine became his anchor, 6 a.m. sharp, 30 laps, the same disciplined rhythm that had sustained him through deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless missions he could never discuss. Willowbrook Commons marketed itself as a premier residential community where Mediterranean architecture met Southern hospitality. The brochure had featured smiling families around the very pool where James now found himself trapped, though notably, every face in those glossy photos had been white. The monthly HOA fees of $450 promised exceptional community standards and lifestyle management. What the brochure hadn't mentioned was Karen Mitchell. Karen had been HOA president for 3 years, elected on a platform of maintaining property values through rigorous enforcement of community standards. Her husband, Bradley, ran a successful law practice specializing in municipal contracts, and together they represented the kind of power couple that dominated Willowbrook's social hierarchy. Karen drove a white BMW SUV with personalized plates reading "Prez Car" and treated her position with the seriousness of a cabinet appointment. The complaints had started within James's first week. Anonymous notes appeared on the community bulletin board questioning new residents who don't seem to understand our culture. Karen's monthly newsletter began including reminders about proper pool etiquette and ensuring guests are appropriately supervised. The language was carefully coded, never explicitly racial, but James recognized the pattern from his years investigating discrimination cases within the military justice system. He had hoped that keeping a low profile might ease the tension. James arrived at the pool early enough to avoid other residents, maintained impeccable behavior, and even volunteered to help with community maintenance. When Mrs. Carter from Unit 2A struggled with her groceries, he carried them to her door. When young Tommy Rodriguez lost his soccer ball in the storm drain, James spent an hour retrieving it. These small acts of service felt natural to him. Leadership through example had always been his philosophy. But Karen's hostility only intensified. She began timing her morning jogs to coincide with his swim sessions, always finding reasons to linger near the pool area. Last Tuesday, she had demanded to see his key fob. On Thursday, she questioned whether he was using appropriate sunscreen that won't affect water chemistry. Yesterday, she had photographed his neatly folded towel, claiming to document unauthorized personal items in common areas. James had served in places where American soldiers faced genuine threats daily, where split-second decisions meant life or death. He understood real danger, real conflict. But this suburban psychological warfare felt somehow more exhausting because it was so petty, so needlessly cruel. Karen wasn't trying to defeat an enemy in battle. She was trying to make a fellow human being feel unwelcome in his own home. The other residents had noticed. Some, like the elderly Mr. Patterson from Unit 3C, offered James sympathetic nods but stayed carefully neutral. Others, particularly the younger families, seemed genuinely friendly when Karen wasn't around. Tommy Rodriguez had even asked James about his military service, showing the kind of innocent respect that reminded him why he had chosen to serve in the first place. But Karen had allies too. Her close friend Sandra from Unit 1A nodded approvingly at the newsletter warnings. Bill Henderson, who served as HOA treasurer, seemed eager to support whatever Karen deemed necessary for community standards. They formed a small but vocal minority that treated the homeowners association like their private kingdom. This morning had begun differently. James noticed fewer of the usual hostile glances as residents walked their dogs past the pool area. Mrs. Carter had actually waved from her balcony when she saw him arrive. Tommy Rodriguez and his father were loading baseball equipment into their car, and the boy had called out, "Good morning, Mr. Washington," with genuine enthusiasm. For a moment, James dared to hope that the community might be warming to his presence. The pool itself reflected the morning sky like a perfect mirror, disturbed only by the gentle circulation system that kept the water crystal clear. James had always found peace in water. During his deployment in the Philippines, he had taught himself to swim in military pools whenever stress threatened to overwhelm him. Water didn't judge, didn't discriminate, didn't care about rank or politics or the color of your skin. As he began his laps, James fell into the meditative rhythm that had sustained him through grief, through combat stress, through the loneliness of command. Each stroke carried him further from the pain of Margaret's empty chair at their kitchen table, from the silence in their old house that had become unbearable. Here, in the mechanical repetition of movement, he could find something approaching peace. He had completed 22 laps when he first noticed Karen's presence. She stood at the community building's window, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing animatedly as she spoke. James continued swimming, hoping she would finish her call and move on. He had learned that acknowledging her presence often escalated whatever grievance she was nursing that day. But Karen wasn't making a phone call. She was waiting. When she emerged from the building, clipboard in hand, and that familiar look of determination on her face, James knew his peaceful morning was about to end. She walked with the purposeful stride of someone about to exercise power, her designer workout clothes and expensive accessories marking her territory as clearly as any uniform. The moment she called out to him, demanding his resident card, James felt the familiar weight of institutional harassment settling on his shoulders. He had faced this before, in congressional hearing rooms, in Pentagon briefings, in military courtrooms where powerful people tried to diminish him through procedure and protocol. The difference was that in those settings, he had worn stars on his collar and carried the authority those stars represented. Here, floating in chlorinated water in civilian clothes, he was just another black man being told he didn't belong. As Karen's voice grew sharper and her demands more aggressive, James remained calm through decades of training in crisis management. He had commanded thousands of soldiers, negotiated with foreign officials, and testified before hostile politicians. One angry suburban woman with a clipboard shouldn't have been able to rattle him. But something about her certainty, her absolute conviction that she had the right to humiliate him publicly, cut deeper than professional antagonism. This was personal. This was about who belonged in America, who deserved respect, who had earned the right to swim in peace on a Tuesday morning. As Karen pulled out her phone and began recording, James gripped the pool's edge and prepared himself for whatever came next. He had no idea that within minutes everything would change. He couldn't have imagined that the same woman now trying to destroy him would soon be faced with the truth of exactly who she was really talking to. But for now, all James could do was hold on and endure whatever humiliation Karen Mitchell had planned for him. Karen Mitchell had been preparing for this moment since James Washington moved into Willowbrook Commons 3 months ago. In her mind, this wasn't about race. It was about standards, about protecting the investment that she and Bradley had made in their lifestyle. The community had rules, and those rules existed for good reasons. People needed to understand their place. As she positioned herself at the pool's edge, Karen felt the familiar rush of authority that came with her HOA president badge. She had earned this power through years of volunteer work, committee meetings, and the kind of unglamorous administrative tasks that kept communities like Willowbrook functioning. Unlike the passive residents who simply paid their fees and expected everything to run smoothly, Karen took responsibility. "I don't recognize you, and I've lived here for 7 years," she announced, her voice carrying across the pool area with practiced authority. "Every resident knows they must carry identification when using community facilities." James completed another stroke and turned at the pool's end, his silence only fueling Karen's conviction that she was dealing with someone who thought the rules didn't apply to him. She had seen this before, people who moved into the community and immediately began testing boundaries, seeing what they could get away with. "Sir, I'm speaking to you," Karen said louder, ensuring that any nearby residents would hear her taking charge of the situation. "Pool access requires current resident identification or guest registration. Those are clearly posted rules." When James finally paused at the pool's edge, water dripping from his graying hair, he looked up at her with an expression that Karen found unsettling. There was no anger in his eyes, no defensiveness. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like pity, which infuriated her even more. "Ma'am, my name is James Washington. I live in Unit 4B, he said quietly, his voice carrying a measured tone that somehow made Karen feel like she was the one being evaluated. "That's not sufficient," Karen snapped, pulling out her phone to document the interaction. "I need to see your lease agreement, your resident card, or valid guest registration from the sponsoring resident. These aren't suggestions, they're community bylaws." She began recording, narrating as she held the camera steady. "This is Karen Mitchell, HOA president at Willowbrook Commons. I'm documenting an incident of unauthorized pool use by an individual who refuses to provide proper identification." James remained motionless in the water, his hands gripping the pool's edge with the kind of controlled stillness that comes from years of military discipline. Karen noticed the precision in his posture, the way he held himself even while vulnerable, but she dismissed it as stubbornness. "People like you need to follow the rules more carefully," she continued, her voice taking on the condescending tone she used with contractors who tried to overcharge or teenagers who gathered too loudly in the common areas. "This is a private community with high standards. We can't have random individuals using facilities they haven't paid for." The phrase hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Karen told herself weren't racial, but which she knew would be clearly understood. She had learned long ago how to communicate exactly what she meant without using words that could be easily challenged. "Ma'am, I pay $450 monthly in HOA fees," James replied, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel that made Karen pause momentarily. "I've lived here for 3 months. I have every right to use this pool." "Claims aren't proof," Karen shot back, recovering her momentum. "Anyone can say they live somewhere. I'm responsible for community security, and that means verifying that people using our facilities actually belong here." She gestured toward the expensive townhomes surrounding the pool area, their Mediterranean facades glowing in the morning sun. "Do you understand what it costs to maintain a community like this? The landscaping alone runs $15,000 monthly. The pool maintenance, security systems, common area upkeep, all of that depends on legitimate residents paying their fair share." Karen was building her case now, speaking as much for her phone's camera as for James himself. She knew that if this escalated, and she intended for it to escalate, she would need to demonstrate that her actions were reasonable, measured, and focused on community protection rather than personal prejudice. "I'm going to need you to exit the pool area while I verify your claimed residency," she continued, her tone becoming more official. "If you're telling the truth, this can be resolved quickly through proper channels." James's response was to simply continue floating, his dark eyes meeting hers without flinching. The quiet confidence in his bearing unsettled Karen in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Most people, when challenged by her authority, either became defensive and argumentative or immediately compliant. James seemed to be evaluating her, as if he was the one in position to judge the situation. "Sir, I'm not asking, I'm telling you to leave the pool area immediately," Karen said, her voice rising. "Your refusal to cooperate is making this situation unnecessarily confrontational." She noticed Mrs. Carter watching from her balcony, along with several other residents who had been drawn by the commotion. "Good. Let them see her handling the situation decisively. Let them understand that their HOA president took community security seriously. "I'm calling security," Karen announced, speed dialing the community's contract security service. "We have protocols for situations like this." But even as she made the call, requesting immediate assistance for an uncooperative individual refusing to follow pool regulations, Karen found herself increasingly frustrated by James's composure. He wasn't giving her the angry reaction that would justify escalating measures. Instead, he maintained that same measured stillness, as if he had faced far more serious challenges than one angry woman with a clipboard. When security didn't answer immediately, Karen made a decision that would change everything. "Fine," she said, scrolling to 911 on her phone. "If you won't leave voluntarily, the police can sort this out." As she raised the phone to make the call that would bring law enforcement to Willowbrook Commons, Karen Mitchell had no idea she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. James Washington had faced hostile interrogations before. In congressional hearing rooms where politicians performed for cameras while soldiers' lives hung in the balance. In Pentagon briefings where career officers questioned his decisions under enemy fire. In military tribunals where powerful men tried to undermine his testimony about corruption in defense contracting. Each time he had learned the same lesson. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. As Karen held her phone aloft, recording what she clearly believed would be evidence of his wrongdoing, James made a conscious decision to give her exactly what she seemed to want: his silence. Not because he was intimidated, but because 4 decades of command had taught him to recognize when someone was about to destroy themselves and the wisdom of stepping aside to let it happen. "Are you going to cooperate? Or do I need to explain to the police why you're being so difficult?" Karen demanded, circling the pool's edge like a prosecutor addressing a jury. Her designer sandals clicked against the concrete with each step, creating a rhythm that reminded James of drilling sergeants who mistook volume for authority. James simply floated, his weathered hands maintaining their grip on the pool's tile edge. The morning sun cast dancing reflections across the water, and for a moment he allowed himself to remember teaching Margaret to swim during their first assignment in Hawaii. She had been terrified of deep water then, clutching his shoulders as he guided her through basic strokes. "Trust the water," he had told her. "It will hold you if you don't fight it." "Answer me!" Karen's voice cracked with frustration. "Your silence is making you look guilty of something. What are you hiding?" The accusation hung in the morning air as more residents began emerging from their units. James could see Tommy Rodriguez watching from his family's window, the boy's face pressed against the glass with the kind of fascination children have for adult drama they don't understand. Mrs. Carter had stepped onto her balcony, her morning coffee forgotten as she witnessed the confrontation below. Karen noticed the growing audience and seemed energized by it. She held her phone higher, ensuring she captured both James's face and the expensive townhomes in the background visual evidence of the community standards she was protecting. "Let the record show that this individual has refused multiple requests for identification," she announced to her camera, her voice taking on the theatrical quality of someone performing for a larger audience than just the emergency dispatcher. "He's been verbally aggressive and refuses to comply with basic community regulations." James had not spoken above a conversational tone. He had not made any sudden movements or gestures that could be interpreted as threatening. But he understood that Karen was constructing a narrative, building a case that would justify whatever came next. He had seen this pattern before: the careful selection of facts, the interpretation of neutral actions as hostile, the gradual escalation designed to provoke the very reaction that would then be used as evidence. "Sir, I'm giving you one final opportunity to handle this reasonably," Karen continued, positioning herself directly in front of James so that her phone captured him from the most unflattering angle possible. "Show me your resident identification or explain to the police why you're trespassing in our community." The word "our" carried particular weight, delivered with the kind of possessive emphasis that made clear exactly who belonged and who didn't. James had heard that same inflection in briefing rooms where certain generals spoke about "our military," as if rank automatically conferred ownership of the institution he had served for 4 decades. Young Tommy Rodriguez had apparently convinced his father to step outside because James could now see both of them standing in their doorway. Miguel Rodriguez wore the kind of careful expression that comes from recognizing trouble but not wanting to get involved. James understood. As a fellow minority resident, Miguel probably faced his own challenges with Karen's version of community standards. "Dad, what's happening to Mr. Washington?" Tommy's voice carried across the courtyard, high and confused. "Why is that lady yelling at him?" Miguel quickly ushered his son back inside, but not before James caught the man's apologetic glance. In that moment, James saw the entire dynamic of Willowbrook Commons laid bare good people staying silent while bad people exercise power, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of becoming targets themselves. Karen had noticed the exchange and seemed pleased by Miguel's retreat. "See how disruptive your presence is?" she said to James. "You're disturbing families, creating unsafe situations for our children." The accusation was so absurd that James almost smiled. He had spent his entire career protecting families, ensuring that American children could sleep safely while he and his soldiers stood watch in dangerous places around the world. But he maintained his silence, knowing that any response would only feed Karen's performance. "I've served this country for 40 years, James finally said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard the first time he spoke. "I know my rights, and I know when someone is trying to deny them." The words seemed to hit Karen like a physical blow. For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty flickered across her face. Something in James's tone, in the way he carried himself even while floating in water, suggested depths she hadn't anticipated. "Everyone claims to be a veteran when they get caught breaking rules," she said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "Service doesn't give you the right to ignore community regulations." James met her eyes directly, and for a moment Karen felt the full weight of his evaluation. She saw something there that made her think of news footage from military ceremonies, of generals briefing presidents, of men who had made decisions that affected thousands of lives. But that was impossible. This was just some troublemaker trying to use facilities he hadn't paid for. "Ma'am, I'm not asking you to believe anything," James said quietly. "I'm asking you to be careful about what you're about to do." The warning carried an undertone that made Karen step back instinctively, but she had gone too far to retreat now, recording too much evidence of her authority to back down without losing face. The other residents were watching, waiting to see whether their HOA president would maintain community standards or be intimidated by someone who thought the rules didn't apply to him. "Are you threatening me?" she demanded, raising her phone to capture what she hoped would be an admission of aggression. "Because that's exactly the kind of behavior that proves you don't belong in a family community like this." James simply shook his head, a gesture so slight it was almost imperceptible. But something in that small movement suggested infinite patience, the kind of calm that comes from having faced real threats and recognizing the difference between genuine danger and suburban theater. Karen's finger hovered over the 911 button on her phone. Once she made this call, there would be no taking it back. Police would come, reports would be filed, and everyone in Willowbrook Commons would know that she had taken decisive action to protect their community. She pressed the button. As the phone began to ring, James Washington closed his eyes and prepared for what he knew would be the most painful conversation of Karen Mitchell's life. 911, what's your emergency?" Karen's voice immediately shifted into the dramatic cadence of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind. "Yes, I need police at Willowbrook Commons residential community immediately. We have a black male who's trespassing on our property and refusing to leave when ordered." The dispatcher's professional tone remained steady. "What's the address, ma'am?" 1247 Willowbrook Drive, Virginia. This is an upscale gated community, and we have an individual who doesn't belong here using our private pool facilities. He's being verbally aggressive and threatening toward residents. James remained motionless in the water, his silence apparently confirming Karen's narrative in her own mind. She began pacing along the pool's edge, her phone held high to capture every angle of what she was certain would vindicate her actions. "Ma'am, is anyone in immediate physical danger?" the dispatcher asked. "Well, no, but he's creating a threatening atmosphere. He refuses to show identification, he won't leave when asked, and now he's making veiled threats about what will happen to me. Karen's voice rose with each word, building drama for her recording. This is exactly the kind of situation that escalates into violence if not handled immediately. As she spoke, Karen felt the intoxicating rush of being absolutely right. She was protecting her community, maintaining standards, ensuring that people understood there were consequences for ignoring rules. The monthly HOA meetings, the countless hours spent reviewing regulations and addressing complaints, it all led to moments like this, when leadership meant taking decisive action. "Ma'am, can you describe the individual?" The dispatcher continued with professional detachment. "Black male, approximately 6 feet tall, athletic build, probably in his 60s. He's in the pool right now, refusing to get out despite multiple requests from community leadership." Karen glanced at James as she spoke, noting how his stillness somehow made him seem more threatening rather than less. "He claims to live here, but I know every legitimate resident." The dispatcher asked several more routine questions while Karen provided increasingly elaborate details. She described James's intimidating stare, his refusal to engage in normal conversation, and his suspicious behavior around community facilities. Each embellishment felt justified by the seriousness of the situation she was creating. "Officers are en route, ma'am. Please remain on the line until they arrive." "Excellent," Karen replied, feeling vindicated by the official response. "This is Karen Mitchell, president of the Willowbrook Commons Homeowners Association. I'll be available to provide a complete briefing when your officers arrive." She ended the emergency call and immediately opened her phone's video application. This needed to be documented thoroughly, not just for the police report, but for the community board, for the management company, and potentially for legal proceedings if James decided to challenge his removal. "This is official documentation of an incident at Willowbrook Commons," she announced to her camera, holding it steady despite her excitement. "I am Karen Mitchell, duly elected president of the Homeowners Association, addressing a serious breach of community security protocols." James watched this performance with the same measured attention he had brought to congressional hearings where politicians grandstanded while real issues went unaddressed. He recognized the careful construction of authority, the way Karen was transforming a simple misunderstanding into a crisis that required dramatic intervention. "Let the record reflect that the individual in question has been given multiple opportunities to comply with basic identification requirements," Karen continued, her voice taking on the formal tone she used during board meetings. "His consistent refusal and increasingly threatening demeanor have necessitated police intervention for community safety." As she spoke, more residents began emerging from their units, drawn by the commotion and the promise of neighborhood drama. Sandra Hoffman from Unit 1A appeared on her balcony with coffee and the satisfied expression of someone watching troublemakers get their comeuppance. Bill Henderson walked his dog past the pool area with deliberate slowness, clearly gathering information for later discussion at the HOA board meeting. Mrs. Carter from Unit 2A stood on her balcony with obvious discomfort, wringing her hands as she watched the confrontation unfold. James caught her eye briefly and offered a small, reassuring nod, a gesture that seemed to surprise her with its gentleness. "Community security isn't just about preventing crime," Karen explained to her camera, warming to her theme. "It's about maintaining the standards and atmosphere that residents pay premium prices to enjoy. When people think they can ignore our rules, it undermines everything we've worked to build here." Tommy Rodriguez had apparently convinced his father to let him outside because the 8-year-old suddenly appeared at the pool gate, pressing his face between the iron bars with the curiosity of childhood. "Mr. Washington, what's happening?" Tommy called out, his voice high with concern. "Why is that lady yelling at you?" Karen whirled toward the interruption, irritated that her documentation was being disrupted by a child who didn't understand the gravity of the situation. "Tommy, go back to your unit immediately. This is not appropriate for children to witness." "But Mr. Washington lives here," Tommy protested with absolute certainty. "He helped me get my ball out of the storm drain last week. He told me about being in the Army." The boy's innocent testimony seemed to shake Karen's confidence momentarily, but she quickly dismissed it. Children could be easily confused, easily manipulated by adults who wanted to create false impressions of legitimacy. "Children don't understand these complex situations," she said firmly, both to Tommy and to her recording. "This is exactly why maintaining proper security protocols is so important, protecting our families from potentially dangerous individuals who attempt to gain access through deception." Miguel Rodriguez appeared behind his son, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but reluctant to intervene directly. "Tommy, come inside now. Let the adults handle this." "But Dad, Mr. Washington isn't doing anything wrong," Tommy insisted. "He's really nice. He showed me how to fold the flag properly, remember?" Miguel's face went pale at his son's words. He gently but firmly took Tommy's hand and led him away from the gate, but not before shooting an apologetic glance toward James, an acknowledgement that carried the weight of understanding and helplessness. Karen seized on the family's retreat as validation of her actions. "See how this individual's presence creates anxiety for our residents? Families feeling unsafe in their own community? This is precisely what our regulations are designed to prevent." She turned her attention back to James, who remained floating peacefully despite the chaos she was orchestrating around him. His composure struck her as almost unnatural. Most people, when faced with police involvement, showed stress, anger, or at least some acknowledgement of the seriousness of their situation. "I hope you're prepared to explain yourself to the officers," she said, moving closer to ensure her camera captured both their faces. "They're going to want to know why you thought community rules didn't apply to you. Why did you become hostile when asked for simple identification?" James's response was to simply float, his eyes closed, finding some inner calm despite the storm gathering around him. The gesture was so peaceful, it almost seemed like meditation, which only frustrated Karen more. "Don't think that playing innocent will work with law enforcement," she snapped. "I have everything documented. Your refusal to cooperate, your threatening behavior, your disruption of community peace. They'll see exactly what kind of person refuses to follow basic rules." In the distance, sirens began their mournful wail through the Virginia morning. The sound sent a thrill through Karen validation that serious people took her concerns seriously, that her authority as HOA president carried real weight beyond the community boundaries. "Here they come," she announced with deep satisfaction, checking her appearance in her phone's front-facing camera. "Now maybe you'll understand that actions have consequences in civilized society." The sirens grew progressively louder, suggesting multiple vehicles responding to what the dispatcher had clearly classified as a significant incident. Karen felt a surge of vindication. Obviously, the emergency services recognized the seriousness of the situation and were deploying appropriate resources. James opened his eyes as the sirens reached crescendo volume just outside the community's main gate. Through 40 years of military service, he had developed an acute sensitivity to approaching authority. But unlike Karen, who heard validation in those wailing sounds, James heard something that filled him with profound sadness. He thought of Margaret, who had worried about him throughout their marriage. Not about combat deployments or dangerous assignments overseas, but about moments exactly like this. Times when his uniform, his service record, his fundamental humanity might not be enough to protect him from people who had already decided what they were going to see. "I want you to remember this exact moment," Karen said, holding her phone steady as 3 police cruisers turned into the Willowbrook Commons entrance. "Remember that you had every single opportunity to handle this situation reasonably and chose confrontation instead." James gripped the pool's edge more tightly as car doors slammed in the parking area and radio static filled the morning air. He could hear multiple officers approaching, their equipment creating a metallic symphony of authority that he knew intimately from decades of coordination with military police. As footsteps approached the pool area, Karen positioned herself to greet the officers with all the dignity her position commanded and all the righteousness her cause demanded. She straightened her blazer, ensured her HOA badge was clearly visible, and prepared to demonstrate exactly why communities needed strong leadership to maintain their standards. The first officer rounded the corner of the pool house, and Karen stepped forward with her most authoritative bearing. She had no idea that she was about to meet three men who had served under the direct command of the person she was attempting to destroy, or that her perfect morning of exercised authority was about to become the most humiliating experience of her life. Officer David Martinez was the first to round the corner of the pool house, his hand resting casually on his radio as he approached what dispatch had described as a trespassing incident at an upscale residential community. Behind him followed Officers Johnson and Walker, both veterans like himself, all three men carrying themselves with the measured professionalism that comes from years of dealing with neighborhood disputes and HOA complaints. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly," Karen began, stepping forward with clipboard in hand and phone still recording. "I'm Karen Mitchell, president of the Willowbrook Commons Homeowners Association. We have a serious trespassing situation that requires immediate—" Martinez stopped mid-stride, his eyes focusing on the figure in the pool with the kind of sharp recognition that made his training kick in automatically. For a moment, time seemed suspended as the officer's mind processed what he was seeing, rejecting it, then accepting the impossible reality before him. "Jesus Christ," Martinez whispered under his breath, then caught himself and stood straighter. "Sir? General Washington? Sir, what are you—" The transformation in Officer Martinez was immediate and unmistakable. His casual approach became rigid military bearing. His hand moved instinctively toward a salute before stopping as he remembered he was in civilian law enforcement now. Behind him, Officers Johnson and Walker followed his gaze and underwent their own moments of stunned recognition. "Oh my God," Officer Johnson breathed, his voice carrying the awe of a soldier unexpectedly encountering his former commanding officer. "General, sir, we had no idea." Karen's confident presentation faltered as she watched the three officers suddenly snap to attention with a precision that seemed almost choreographed. Their casual law enforcement posture vanished, replaced by the kind of military bearing she had only seen in movies. "What's happening?" Karen demanded, confusion replacing her earlier authority. "Why are you acting like—" "Ma'am," Officer Martinez interrupted without taking his eyes off James. "This is General James Washington, former commanding officer of the 82nd Airborne Division. Sir, with your permission." In perfect unison, all three officers brought their hands to their foreheads in crisp military salutes, their faces showing the kind of respect reserved for heroes. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of pool water and the distant sound of morning traffic beyond Willowbrook's gates. James, still floating in the pool, nodded solemnly before pulling himself up to the pool's edge with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to command. Water cascaded from his silver hair as he stood, and even in civilian swim attire, his bearing carried unmistakable authority. "At ease, gentlemen," James said quietly, his voice carrying the same calm command that had guided thousands of soldiers through combat operations. "Thank you for your service." The officers lowered their salutes, but maintained their respectful attention. Karen stood frozen, her phone still recording what was rapidly becoming the documentation of her own humiliation rather than James's removal. "Sir, we served under you in Afghanistan, 2018 to 2019, Officer Walker said, his voice thick with emotion. "You probably don't remember us specifically, but—" "I remember," James interrupted gently. "David Martinez, you were wounded in the Kandahar operation. Made it back to your unit in record time because you didn't want to let your team down. Johnson, you saved 3 civilians during the market bombing in Kabul. And Walker, you organized the base's literacy program for local children." The three officers exchanged glances of amazement that their former general remembered such specific details about their service. For Karen, watching this reunion unfold, reality began to shift in ways she wasn't prepared to handle. "I don't understand," she said weakly, her voice barely audible. "What's happening here?" Officer Martinez turned to her with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with barely contained disgust. "Ma'am, General Washington is one of the most decorated officers in recent military history. He commanded the 82nd Airborne for 8 years, served 4 tours of duty, and received the Distinguished Service Cross for actions under enemy fire." "But he's just—" Karen began, then stopped as she realized what she had been about to say in front of 3 police officers who clearly revered the man she had just tried to have arrested. "He's just what, ma'am?" Officer Johnson asked, his tone carefully neutral but carrying an edge that made Karen step back instinctively. Karen's mind raced as she tried to process this complete reversal of everything she had believed about the situation. The man she had harassed, recorded, and called police to remove was apparently someone these officers considered a hero. The authority she had exercised so confidently minutes earlier now seemed not just wrong but grotesquely inappropriate. "Ma'am," Officer Walker said, consulting his notepad, "you called 911 to report that this gentleman was trespassing and being threatening. Can you explain what you meant by threatening behavior?" Karen looked at her phone, still recording, then at James, who stood with quiet dignity beside the pool. The contrast between her frantic accusations and his composed presence suddenly seemed stark beyond belief. He wouldn't show me his resident card," she stammered. "And he seemed..." "He seemed what?" Martinez pressed, his voice carrying the authority of someone no longer willing to tolerate nonsense. "Threatening," Karen finished lamely, the word sounding ridiculous even as she spoke it. The three officers looked at James, then back at Karen, their expressions making clear exactly what they thought of the idea that this decorated war hero posed any threat to a suburban homeowners association president. "General Washington," Officer Johnson said formally, "have you been threatening anyone this morning?" "No, Officer Johnson, I have not," James replied calmly. "I was swimming laps in my community's pool as I do every morning. Mrs. Mitchell approached me demanding identification, which escalated from there." "And do you live here, sir?" Martinez asked, though his tone made clear he was asking for the record rather than from any doubt. "Unit 4B, James confirmed. "I've been a resident for 3 months. Karen felt the last of her authority crumbling as the officers nodded and made notes in their reports. What had begun as her documented victory over someone who didn't belong was transformed into an official record of her harassment of a war hero. "Ma'am," Officer Walker said, turning back to Karen with professional courtesy that carried unmistakable reproach, "making false reports to emergency services is a serious matter. Filing charges for threatening behavior when no threats were made. Claiming trespassing when someone is lawfully using their own community facilities." "I didn't know," Karen said desperately. "He should have told me who he was." "Ma'am," James said quietly, speaking directly to her for the first time since the officers arrived. "I shouldn't have to prove my worth to use a pool I pay for. My service doesn't make me more deserving of basic respect than any other resident." The profound silence that followed carried the weight of a lesson Karen Mitchell was only beginning to understand, while 3 police officers stood witness to the difference between earned authority and borrowed power. Tommy Rodriguez had been watching from his bedroom window when the police officers saluted Mr. Washington, and the 8-year-old's excitement was too much to contain. While his father Miguel dealt with work calls in the kitchen, Tommy grabbed his tablet and did what every child his age did when they witnessed something extraordinary. He recorded it. "Dad! Dad! The police are saluting Mr. Washington!" Tommy called out, his fingers already working to upload the 30-second video to his father's Facebook account. The boy had helped his father post family photos before, and the process was automatic to him. Miguel rushed to the window just as Tommy hit share, adding the caption his father had taught him to use for community posts. "Willowbrook Commons, this is so cool. Police saluting our neighbor, Mr. Washington." Within minutes, Miguel's military friends began commenting. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from his old unit shared it immediately with the caption, "Respect to General Washington, hero among us." The video began its journey through military networks, veteran groups, and community pages with the exponential speed that only authentic human moments achieve. At her kitchen table, 3 units away, Sandra Hoffman watched the same scene unfold through her window while simultaneously refreshing her various social media feeds. As Karen's closest friend and HOA board ally, Sandra felt compelled to provide context before the situation spiraled beyond their control. "Incident at Willowbrook Commons," she typed rapidly on her neighborhood Facebook group. Karen Mitchell was forced to call the police on an aggressive trespasser this morning. Some residents defend him, claiming he lives here, but our HOA president was protecting community safety. Proud of Karen for taking a stand. Sandra's post gained immediate traction from other residents who hadn't witnessed the actual confrontation, but supported strong HOA enforcement. Within an hour, her version of events had been shared to 3 other neighborhood groups and the Willowbrook Community Watch page. But Tommy's video was spreading faster. The first major amplification came when Miguel's cousin Maria, a social media manager for a veterans advocacy organization, saw the footage during her morning content review. The image of 3 police officers saluting an elderly black man by a swimming pool struck her as powerfully symbolic, especially without immediate context about who they were saluting or why. "This is beautiful," she posted to the Veterans United Facebook page, which had over 200,000 followers. "Respect recognizes respect. Sometimes our heroes are hiding in plain sight. #veteran recognition #respect. The Veterans United post exploded. Within 2 hours, it had been shared 1,200 times and received over 5,000 reactions. Comments poured in from veterans across the country sharing their own stories of unrecognized service members, of heroes living quietly in suburban communities, of the importance of honoring those who served. The viral momentum accelerated exponentially when Tommy's video caught the attention of Marcus Williams, a Baltimore-based social media influencer who specialized in racial justice content. Marcus had built a following of 150,000 by highlighting instances of discrimination and celebrating moments when justice prevailed. Marcus screen-recorded Tommy's video and added his own commentary. "Wait for it. Karen calls the police on black man at the pool. Watch what happens when they recognize who he really is. This is what we mean when we say you don't know people's stories. #Karen at the pool #justice served #salute general." Marcus's post triggered an avalanche. Within 6 hours, #Karen at the pool was trending on Twitter with over 50,000 mentions. The story had morphed beyond the original incident, becoming a symbol of presumptuous authority meeting actual heroism. Popular TikTok creator Ashley Carter duetted the video with her own reaction, adding text overlay, "POV, you're racist and call police on a war hero." Her version gained 2.3 million views in 12 hours, with comments ranging from military families sharing their own experiences to teenagers expressing outrage at Karen's behavior. Reddit's #Justice Served community picked up the story within hours, with the original post receiving over 45,000 upvotes and 3,200 comments. Users began their own investigation, cross-referencing HOA meeting minutes, property records, and local news archives to build a comprehensive picture of Karen's enforcement patterns. Karen Mitchell Megathread, Timeline of Discrimination, read the top post, which detailed 17 instances over 3 years where Karen had disproportionately targeted minority residents with HOA violations. The post included redacted images of violation notices, screenshots of threatening emails, and testimony from affected residents. Karen remained blissfully unaware of the digital storm gathering around her, until her daughter Brittany called from her college dorm room in panic. "Mom, what did you do?" Brittany's voice was shrill with teenage mortification. "There's a video of you yelling at some war hero, and it's literally everywhere. My sorority sisters are sending it to me asking if that's really my mom." Karen frantically opened her phone and searched for her name on social media. The results were devastating. Tommy's innocent video had been viewed over 800,000 times across various platforms. Worse, internet detectives had already identified her, linked her to her real estate business, and begun examining her past HOA enforcement actions. Thread, "Let's talk about Karen Mitchell, 147th, read one Twitter post that had been retweeted 8,000 times. "This woman who called the police on a decorated war hero has a pattern. Here are HOA violations she's issued in the past year, analyzed by resident demographics." The thread included professionally compiled statistics showing that while minorities made up 23% of Willowbrook Commons residents, they received 67% of HOA violations. Charts and graphs demonstrated the pattern with mathematical precision, making Karen's discrimination undeniable. Local news station WJLA picked up the story by early afternoon, sending reporter Christina Martinez to Willowbrook Commons for a live segment. "We're here at the luxury community where a homeowners association president called police on a distinguished military veteran, apparently without realizing his service record," Martinez reported as residents gathered behind her. The Willowbrook Commons Facebook page, once a quiet forum for package delivery notices and maintenance updates, exploded into a battlefield. Longtime residents began sharing their own stories about Karen's enforcement tactics. "She demanded to see my lease when I was walking my dog," posted Mrs. Carter. "Said my guest needed to be properly supervised. The guest was my own daughter visiting from college. Karen made me provide 3 forms of identification to use the gym, then questioned whether my rental agreement was legitimate," added David Park from Unit 3D. "She called code enforcement on my family's barbecue, claiming cultural cooking odors violated community standards," wrote Fatima Hassan from Unit 5A. "We were grilling hamburgers." Each new testimony added to the growing portrait of systematic harassment disguised as community management. The pattern was clear, documented, and increasingly difficult for Karen or her supporters to dismiss. The social media storm reached professional consequences faster than Karen could have imagined. Her real estate brokerage, Prestige Properties of Virginia, began receiving calls from potential clients who had seen the viral video. By afternoon, the office manager was fielding angry voicemails from people demanding to know why they employed someone who harassed war heroes. "Prestige Properties needs to fire Karen Mitchell immediately," read a Google review that had been liked 2,400 times. Would you trust someone who discriminates against military veterans to help you buy a home? Bradley Mitchell, Karen's husband, was in the middle of a deposition for a municipal contract case when his assistant slipped him a note. "Urgent. Your wife is trending on Twitter. Not good." During the next break, Bradley frantically Googled his wife's name and felt his stomach drop. The man she had harassed wasn't just any veteran. He was General James Washington, whose military record was now being shared across every major veterans forum online. Distinguished Service Cross, 4 combat tours, 8 years commanding the 82nd Airborne. The kind of resume that made politicians stand when he entered a room. Even worse for Bradley, some of the more enterprising internet investigators had begun connecting dots between Karen's harassment patterns and his law firm's representation of Willowbrook Commons. Questions were emerging about potential conflicts of interest, about whether legal fees were being used to support discriminatory enforcement actions. "Breaking. Lawyer husband's firm represents HOA," read one viral tweet with 15,000 retweets. "How much community money is being spent on legal fees to harass minority residents? Where's the financial oversight? #follow the money #HOA corruption." The Virginia State Bar Association announced they were reviewing complaints about Bradley's firm, while the Fair Housing Council scheduled emergency hearings about Willowbrook Commons practices. By evening, the #SaluteGeneral had been adopted by veteran organizations nationwide. The original video of police officers saluting James had been viewed over 2 million times across all platforms. Major news outlets were picking up the story, with CNN scheduling a segment about hidden heroes in our communities for the following morning. Military influencer and Gold Star wife Sarah Thompson posted a heartbreaking video about her late husband's experiences with civilian discrimination. "This is why representation matters," she said through tears. "Veterans come home and deserve respect in their own communities. General Washington served so people like Karen could live freely, and this is how she repays him." Sarah's emotional response was shared 100,000 times within hours, adding another layer of outrage to the growing movement. Karen sat in her BMW in the Prestige Properties parking lot, too mortified to go inside and face her colleagues. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications, friend requests from strangers, tagged posts she didn't want to see, and increasingly urgent messages from clients questioning whether they wanted to work with someone who had become a symbol of neighborhood discrimination. The most painful notifications came from people she considered friends. High school classmates were sharing the video with comments like, "Can't believe this is the Karen we went to school with." Her book club had created a group chat discussing whether she should remain a member. Even her own mother had called, asking why she was making such a scene over nothing. As darkness fell over Willowbrook Commons, Karen Mitchell realized her morning of exercised authority had become a digital reckoning that would follow her for years to come. By Wednesday morning, investigative journalist Sarah Carter had received over 200 tips related to the Willowbrook Commons incident. As a senior reporter for the Washington Post's Metro section, Sarah specialized in housing discrimination and municipal corruption. The viral video of police officers saluting General Washington had caught her attention not for its dramatic moment, but for what it suggested about systematic problems beneath the surface. Sarah's first call was to Miguel Rodriguez, whose son had inadvertently sparked the national conversation. Miguel agreed to meet at a coffee shop outside Willowbrook Commons, away from the media circus that had descended on the community overnight. "I never wanted this to become so big," Miguel said, stirring his coffee nervously. "Tommy just thought it was cool that police officers were saluting our neighbor, but now that it's out there, maybe it needed to come out." Miguel pulled out his tablet and showed Sarah screenshots he had been collecting. "Look, this is from the HOA violation database that residents can access online. I started tracking it after Karen gave me grief about my work truck being a commercial vehicle in violation of community standards." The data Miguel had compiled was devastating. Over the past 3 years, Willowbrook Commons had issued 247 formal violations. Sarah examined the spreadsheet Miguel had created, cross-referencing violation types with resident demographics based on publicly available property records and voter registration data. The pattern was mathematically undeniable. While residents of color comprised 28% of the community, they received 71% of all violations. The disparities were even more stark in certain categories. Unauthorized vehicles violations were issued to minority residents at a rate 400% higher than white residents. Landscaping violations showed a 350% disparity. Noise complaints demonstrated a 280% difference. "This is incredible work," Sarah told Miguel. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" "I sent it to the Fair Housing Council yesterday," Miguel replied. "But I wanted to make sure a real journalist saw it too. People need to understand this isn't about one incident. This is about a system." Sarah spent the next hour reviewing Miguel's documentation in detail. He had methodically tracked every violation notice, categorizing them by type, severity, and resolution outcome. The data revealed that minority residents were not only cited more frequently, but also faced harsher penalties for identical violations. "Look at these parking violations," Miguel explained, pointing to a section of his spreadsheet. When white residents received citations for overnight guest parking, 89% resulted in warnings. When minority residents received the same citations, 73% resulted in fines and only 12% resulted in warnings. The pattern extended to appeal processes. White residents who contested violations had a 67% success rate in getting penalties reduced or dismissed. Minority residents succeeded in only 23% of their appeals, despite often providing identical documentation and evidence. Sarah's next stop was the Fairfax County Courthouse, where HOA meeting minutes and financial records were maintained as public documents. What she discovered there made the violation patterns look like merely the tip of a much larger iceberg. Willowbrook Commons' legal expenses had increased 340% over the past 3 years, with the bulk of those fees paid to Mitchell, Bradley, and Associates, Karen's husband's law firm. The community had spent over $180,000 in legal fees, ostensibly for community standards enforcement and resident compliance actions. But the detailed billing records told a different story. Bradley Mitchell's firm had charged the HOA for drafting increasingly complex violation procedures, creating new enforcement protocols, and developing what the invoices euphemistically called resident verification systems. Each new procedure seemed designed to create additional barriers for residents who didn't fit Karen's vision of community standards. The billing entries were specific enough to be damning. $2,400 for developing cultural sensitivity guidelines for holiday decorations. $3,600 for researching occupancy limit enforcement in multi-generational households. $1,800 for drafting noise ordinance modifications for non-traditional music. Each line item represented legal work designed to restrict behaviors more common in minority communities. The financial trail led Sarah to former HOA board member Janet Walsh, who had resigned 6 months earlier in protest. Janet agreed to meet at her new home across town, away from Willowbrook Commons politics. "I couldn't stay on the board once I understood what was happening," Janet explained, setting down tea in her living room. Karen presented everything as maintaining property values and protecting community investment, but the enforcement was clearly discriminatory. Janet produced a folder thick with documents she had kept from her time on the board. Look at these proposed rule changes Karen pushed through. Restrictions on cultural decorations during holidays, limits on non-traditional landscaping that happened to target residents who planted vegetables or native plants instead of grass lawns. Requirements for pre-approval of any gathering larger than 6 people in common areas. Each rule, Janet explained, was crafted with legal precision by Bradley's firm to avoid explicit discrimination while achieving discriminatory results. They knew exactly what they were doing. Bradley would draft these rules that sounded neutral, but were designed to target specific behaviors or preferences more common in certain communities. Janet shared meeting minutes from board sessions where Karen had been remarkably explicit about her intentions. In a March 2022 meeting, Karen had stated, "We need to ensure that new residents understand our community culture and standards. Some people come from backgrounds where they're not familiar with how upscale communities operate." In June 2022, Karen had pushed for new parking restrictions specifically targeting commercial-style vehicles, which happened to encompass the work trucks, vans, and older cars, more commonly owned by the community's Latino residents. "We can't have our community looking like a construction site," the minutes quoted Karen as saying. Most revealing was a September 2022 exchange where Janet had questioned the fairness of proposed noise restrictions. Karen's recorded response was chilling. "We have to be realistic about cultural compatibility. Some behaviors that might be acceptable in other communities don't align with the lifestyle our residents expect." Sarah's investigation deepened when she discovered that General Washington wasn't Karen's first high-profile target. Through Freedom of Information Act requests, she uncovered a pattern of police calls from Willowbrook Commons that stretched back years. Dr. Aisha Patel, an emergency room physician at Innova Fairfax Hospital, had been the subject of 3 police calls in 2022. Each time Karen had reported suspicious activity related to Dr. Patel's late-night arrivals home from hospital shifts. The police reports showed that officers quickly determined no criminal activity was occurring, but the pattern of harassment was clear. "She made my life miserable for 6 months," Dr. Patel told Sarah during a phone interview. "Every time I came home from a 12-hour shift saving lives, I had to worry about police cars in my driveway because Karen decided my schedule was suspicious." The harassment had escalated beyond mere police calls. Karen had demanded that Dr. Patel provide documentation proving her employment at the hospital, questioned whether her medical equipment constituted home business operations, and filed complaints about her unusual visitor patterns, referring to Dr. Patel's colleagues who occasionally stopped by to discuss patient cases. Professor David Kim from George Mason University had faced similar treatment in 2021, with Karen repeatedly calling authorities about his unauthorized home office activities. Professor Kim's crime had been conducting virtual lectures from his study during the pandemic, which Karen characterized as running an illegal business from residential property. "I was teaching organic chemistry to college students via Zoom," Professor Kim explained. "But Karen treated it like I was operating some kind of criminal enterprise. She actually demanded to inspect my home to ensure I wasn't violating zoning laws." Karen had escalated her campaign against Professor Kim by filing complaints with the county zoning board, demanding investigations into his commercial internet usage, and organizing a petition among residents claiming his teaching activities created increased traffic and noise. The complaints were ultimately dismissed, but the stress had taken a toll on Professor Kim's family. The most disturbing case involved the Okafor family, Nigerian immigrants who had faced 18 months of escalating harassment before finally moving out of Willowbrook Commons in 2021. Through interviews with former neighbors and HOA records, Sarah pieced together a campaign of systematic intimidation. Karen had targeted the Okafor's children's outdoor play, claiming their games were too loud and culturally inappropriate. She had complained about their cooking odors, demanded inspection of their home-based tutoring business, and questioned whether their multiple adult family members violated occupancy limits. The harassment had been relentless and creative. Karen filed noise complaints about the Okafor's traditional music during family celebrations. She reported them for unauthorized food preparation when they grilled traditional Nigerian dishes in the community's designated barbecue area. She questioned their guests' parking arrangements during their son's graduation party, despite the event being held entirely within HOA guidelines. "They drove that family out," confirmed Mrs. Carter, who had remained friends with the Okafors after their departure. "Beautiful people, contributing members of the community, but Karen made their lives impossible. They finally sold at a loss just to escape the harassment." Sarah's investigation revealed that the Okafors' departure wasn't coincidental. Bradley Mitchell's law firm had purchased their townhome through a shell company just days after the family accepted a below-market offer. The property was subsequently flipped to new buyers at a $47,000 profit. Property records showed this wasn't an isolated incident. Over the past 3 years, 4 homes previously owned by minority families had been purchased by entities connected to Bradley's firm shortly after the families faced intensive HOA harassment campaigns. Each property was resold at significant profit, suggesting a deliberate strategy of discriminatory enforcement leading to forced sales and financial gain. The financial connections became even more complex when Sarah discovered that Karen and Bradley had ownership interests in several local businesses that provided services to HOA communities. Bradley's law firm received referral fees from the security company, landscaping contractor, and property management firm that Willowbrook Commons employed. "It's a closed loop," explained housing attorney Maria Santos when Sarah consulted her about the arrangement. "They create problems through discriminatory enforcement, charge the community legal fees to defend their enforcement actions, then profit from the services required to address the problems they created." The financial web extended further than Sarah initially realized. Bradley's firm held partial ownership in Secure Communities, LLC, the company that provided security services to 12 different HOA communities. Karen sat on the board of directors for Premium Landscaping Solutions, which held exclusive contracts with 8 communities where Bradley provided legal services. Most damaging was the discovery of Willowbrook Investment Holdings, a shell company jointly owned by Karen and Bradley that had purchased and resold 17 properties in HOA communities over the past 5 years. Each property had previously been owned by minority families who faced intensive violation campaigns before selling at below-market prices. Sarah's investigation took a dramatic turn when she received an unexpected phone call from Rebecca Harrison, who identified herself as Bradley Mitchell's former paralegal. "I quit 6 months ago because I couldn't stomach what they were doing," Rebecca said during a clandestine meeting in a downtown parking garage. "I have copies of internal memos, billing records, strategy documents, everything showing how they systematically targeted minority residents." Rebecca's documents were explosive. Internal firm emails discussed problem residents who needed to be encouraged to relocate. Strategic memos outlined how to craft violations that would be legally defensible but practically discriminatory. Billing records showed charges for community demographic analysis and resident profile assessment. The most damaging evidence was a recorded phone conversation between Bradley and Karen discussing the Washington situation 2 weeks before the pool incident. Rebecca had secretly recorded the conversation on her phone after overhearing it in Bradley's office. In the recording, Karen expressed frustration that General Washington doesn't respond to normal pressure and worried that his military bearing made other residents take his side. She complained that his presence was emboldening other problem residents to resist her authority. Bradley's voice on the recording was chilling. "We need to create a situation where his behavior becomes the issue, not our enforcement. Get him angry, get him to respond inappropriately, then we have grounds for escalation." Karen's response was equally damaging. "I've been timing my morning routines to coincide with his pool schedule. If I can provoke him publicly, especially with witnesses around, we can build a case for community disruption." The recording proved that the pool confrontation hadn't been spontaneous harassment. It had been a calculated strategy to provoke General Washington into a reaction that could be used against him. Armed with this evidence, Sarah reached out to General Washington for comment. True to form, he declined an interview but agreed to review her findings for accuracy. "The documents speak for themselves," General Washington said in a brief phone conversation. "I've spent my career fighting corruption in military contracting. I recognize the patterns when I see them in civilian contexts." Sarah's investigation revealed one final, devastating detail that would transform her story from a local housing issue into a national scandal. While reviewing property transfer records across Northern Virginia, she discovered that Willowbrook Commons was part of a larger network of HOA communities, all managed by the same company and represented by firms associated with Bradley Mitchell's practice. The discrimination patterns she had documented weren't isolated to one community. They were replicated across 12 different developments throughout the region, affecting an estimated 3,400 families and involving over $2.3 million in legal fees and property transfers. As Sarah compiled her final notes, she realized she wasn't just documenting one woman's prejudice. She was exposing an entire industry built on legal discrimination disguised as community management, with General Washington's dignity serving as the catalyst that would bring it all crashing down. The Washington Post article hit like a bombshell Thursday morning, but its impact was magnified by what happened next. Within hours of Sarah Carter's investigation going live, victims began emerging from across Northern Virginia, emboldened by the evidence that their individual experiences were part of a documented pattern of systematic discrimination. Dr. Aisha Patel was the first to go public, scheduling a press conference outside Inova Fairfax Hospital where she worked. Standing in her white coat with the American flag backdrop, she spoke with the measured authority of someone who had saved countless lives but couldn't protect herself from neighborhood harassment. "I came to America as a child, became a citizen, went to medical school, and dedicated my career to serving this community," Dr. Patel said, her voice steady but emotional. "I never imagined that after 12-hour shifts saving lives in the emergency room, I would come home to police cars in my driveway because my HOA president decided my schedule was suspicious." Dr. Patel's testimony was devastating because of her unassailable credentials. She was not just a victim of discrimination. She was a healthcare hero whose service to the community was beyond question. Her decision to speak publicly gave other victims the courage to follow. Professor David Kim held his own press conference at George Mason University that afternoon, flanked by colleagues and students who testified about his character and contributions to education. Teaching organic chemistry to college students via Zoom during a pandemic was treated like a criminal enterprise, he said. "The harassment was so intense that my family considered leaving the country we had adopted as our home, but the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source." Mrs. Grace Okafor, the matriarch of the Nigerian family who had been driven from Willowbrook Commons, flew in from Atlanta where they had relocated. At 73 years old, with the dignity of a grandmother who had raised successful children across 2 continents, she commanded immediate respect. "We came to America with nothing but hope," Mrs. Okafor said at a press conference organized by the Virginia Coalition for Fair Housing. "My husband worked 3 jobs to buy that home in Willowbrook Commons. We thought we had achieved the American dream. Instead, we discovered that some people believed the American dream wasn't meant for families like ours." Mrs. Okafor's testimony revealed details that hadn't appeared in Sarah Carter's investigation. Karen had targeted their grandchildren's visits, claiming that having multiple children in the home violated occupancy limits. She had complained about their traditional cooking during family gatherings, describing the aromas as foreign odors that affect property values. Most painfully, Karen had questioned the legitimacy of their son's medical degree when he visited in his physician's coat, demanding documentation that he was actually a doctor and not an unlicensed person providing medical services in the community. "My son graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School," Mrs. Okafor said, her voice breaking with emotion. "He serves in emergency medicine in Detroit, saving lives every day. But Karen Mitchell treated him like a criminal because he was a young black man in a white coat." The Okafor's testimony opened the floodgates of similar stories. The Nguyen family from Unit 7C revealed they had been cited for unauthorized business operations when their teenage daughter gave piano lessons to neighborhood children. The Hassan family from Unit 5, a shared documentation of harassment over their Ramadan celebrations, which Karen had characterized as disruptive religious activities. Each family brought evidence, violation notices, email exchanges, photographs, and witness statements that corroborated Sarah Carter's findings about systematic targeting based on race, religion, and cultural background. The most damaging new evidence came from security guard Marcus Thompson, who had worked the evening shift at Willowbrook Commons for 2 years before quitting in disgust. Thompson agreed to testify about what he had witnessed during his employment. Karen Mitchell would call me with special instructions about certain residents, Thompson explained during a recorded interview with civil rights attorneys. She wanted extra surveillance on specific families, always minorities, and she wanted detailed reports about their activities, visitors, and schedules. Thompson produced logbooks showing Karen's requests for enhanced monitoring of minority residents' comings and goings. The logs revealed a pattern of surveillance that bordered on stalking, with detailed notes about residents' work schedules, family visits, and social activities. She told me to document unusual behavior patterns for certain residents, Thompson continued. When I asked what constituted unusual behavior, she said things like too many visitors, loud conversations in foreign languages, and non-traditional family structures. Most disturbing was Thompson's revelation that Karen had instructed him to photograph residents' license plates and run background checks on their visitors. She wanted ammunition, Thompson said bluntly. She was building files on people she wanted gone. The security logs Thompson provided showed that Karen had specifically requested surveillance on General Washington starting 6 weeks before the pool incident. The logs noted his military-style routine, his solitary behavior patterns, and even speculation about his psychological state as a grieving widower. But the breakthrough that transformed individual testimonies into a federal case came when former Willowbrook Commons accountant Linda Rodriguez came forward with financial records that had been mysteriously lost during a recent audit. Linda had worked for the HOA management company for 5 years before being fired for asking questions about budget irregularities. She had secretly copied financial documents before her termination, sensing they might be important later. The legal fees were just the beginning, Linda explained during a meeting with FBI financial crimes investigators. There were consultant fees, security upgrades, technology improvements, all paid to companies owned by the Mitchell family or their associates. Linda's records showed that Willowbrook Commons had paid over $340,000 in various fees to Mitchell-connected businesses over 3 years. The community's reserve fund had been depleted from $180,000 to just $23,000, despite increasing HOA fees by 35% during the same period. They were essentially using the HOA as their personal bank account, Linda continued. Every community improvement somehow benefited their business interests while targeting the residents they wanted to remove. The financial documents revealed a sophisticated scheme of self-dealing and kickbacks. Karen would identify problems requiring professional services. Bradley would recommend solutions provided by their business partners, and the HOA would pay inflated fees for unnecessary services. Most damaging was documentation showing that the Mitchell family's investment company had made offers on properties owned by targeted families, often within days of intensive violation campaigns. The offers were typically 15 to 20% below market value, but families exhausted by harassment often accepted them to escape the community. Federal investigators were particularly interested in evidence that the Mitchells had coordinated with mortgage companies to expedite foreclosure proceedings on families facing financial stress from legal fees and constant citations. Several families had been forced into bankruptcy defending themselves against HOA violations, making their properties available for below-market acquisition. The scope of the scheme became clear when residents from other communities came forward. The pattern of discrimination, financial manipulation, and forced relocations wasn't limited to Willowbrook Commons. It was replicated across 12 HOA communities throughout Northern Virginia. Carmen Valdez from Fairfax Meadows described identical harassment patterns targeting Latino families. Same violations, same escalation, same pressure to sell and move, she explained. We thought it was isolated racism, but now we understand it was organized crime disguised as community management. The Patel family from Heritage Oaks shared documentation showing they had faced the exact same sequence of violations as Dr. Aisha Patel, suggesting the harassment campaigns followed standardized templates designed to target specific ethnic communities. Most significantly, 3 families came forward with evidence that they had been approached by Willowbrook Investment Holdings, the Mitchell's shell company, with unsolicited purchase offers shortly after facing intensive HOA harassment. The coordination between harassment campaigns and acquisition attempts proved criminal intent. By Friday evening, the FBI had opened formal investigations into housing discrimination, mail fraud, wire fraud, and racketeering charges related to the HOA network. The Virginia Attorney General announced a statewide task force to investigate similar patterns in other communities. Civil rights attorneys filed a class action lawsuit representing over 40 families across multiple communities, seeking damages and injunctive relief to prevent further discrimination. The suit alleged that the Mitchell Network had violated the Fair Housing Act, the Civil Rights Act, and state laws governing HOA management. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when General Washington finally agreed to make a public statement. Standing outside Willowbrook Commons with a small group of veteran supporters, he spoke with the quiet authority that had commanded respect throughout his military career. "This was never about me," he said simply. "This was about a system designed to exclude certain Americans from their own neighborhoods. The families who faced this harassment before me showed tremendous courage. They served their communities as doctors, teachers, and small business owners, just as I served in uniform." General Washington's brief statement included a challenge that resonated across social media and news coverage. "We fought overseas to defend American values of equality and justice. We cannot allow those same values to be undermined in American neighborhoods by people who profit from division and discrimination." The contrast between General Washington's dignity and the emerging evidence of the Mitchells' corruption was stark and powerful. Social media users began sharing the phrase, "This is what honor looks like," alongside images of the general's quiet press conference. By the end of the week, what had started as one woman's harassment of a neighbor had evolved into a federal investigation that would ultimately transform housing discrimination law and HOA oversight across the country. The Willowbrook Commons Community Center had never hosted an event like the one scheduled for Saturday morning. What began as a hastily organized press conference had evolved into something approaching a national reckoning, with media trucks lined along the usually quiet residential streets and satellite dishes creating a temporary communications hub in the parking lot. General James Washington arrived at precisely 0900 hours, as punctual as he had been for every military briefing throughout his 40-year career. But this morning, he wore his dress blue uniform for the first time since his retirement ceremony 18 months earlier. The ribbons on his chest told the story of a lifetime spent in service. Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, and rows of campaign medals representing deployments across 3 decades of American military operations. The sight of General Washington in full dress uniform created an immediate hush among the assembled crowd. Residents who had only known him as the quiet man who swam laps each morning suddenly understood they had been living alongside military royalty. Even the media crews, accustomed to covering politicians and celebrities, recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Miguel Rodriguez stood with his arm around his son Tommy, both of them wearing their best clothes for what Miguel understood was a historic moment. Tommy had been practicing his salute all week, determined to show proper respect to the general who had become his hero. When General Washington approached, Tommy broke from his father's grip and snapped to attention with the imperfect but earnest salute of an 8-year-old. General Washington returned the salute with military precision, then knelt to Tommy's level. "Thank you for your service to our community, Tommy," the general said quietly, his words carrying across the silent courtyard. "Your courage in sharing the truth made all of this possible." The moment was captured by dozens of cameras and would later become one of the most shared images of the entire story. A decorated war hero honoring a child who had inadvertently exposed systematic injustice. As General Washington approached the podium that had been set up near the pool where everything began, he was joined by an honor guard of veterans who had driven from across the region to support him. Retired Colonel Maria Santos had flown in from Texas. Former Navy SEAL David Carter had driven overnight from North Carolina. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams had taken leave from her current assignment at the Pentagon. Dozens of other service members formed a respectful semicircle behind the podium, representing every branch of military service and spanning 4 decades of American military operations. The crowd had grown throughout the morning as word spread across social media and news networks. Local residents mixed with veterans' families, civil rights advocates, and curiosity seekers drawn by the national media attention. Food trucks had positioned themselves along the community's main road, and volunteers from the American Legion were distributing water bottles and small American flags. Dr. Aisha Patel stepped forward first, speaking not just as a victim of discrimination, but as a member of the medical community that had worked alongside military personnel throughout her career. "General Washington represents the best of American values," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "He served our country overseas so that people like me could build lives in communities like this. The harassment he faced was an attack on everything he fought to protect." Dr. Patel's testimony included details that hadn't emerged during the week's investigations. She spoke about receiving anonymous letters questioning her citizenship, about having her medical credentials challenged by residents who assumed she couldn't be a real doctor, about the psychological toll of coming home from life-saving work to face suspicion and hostility. "I have treated wounded veterans in our emergency room," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I have seen the physical and emotional scars that service members carry from their sacrifice for our country. To think that General Washington faced harassment in his own neighborhood after 4 decades of that sacrifice, it's unconscionable." Professor David Kim followed, speaking in the measured tones of an academic who understood the historical significance of the moment. "What happened here wasn't just neighborhood discrimination. It was a betrayal of the social contract that military service represents. General Washington earned his place in any American community through 4 decades of sacrifice. The idea that anyone would question his right to be here is fundamentally un-American." Professor Kim shared research he had conducted during the week, documenting similar patterns of discrimination against military families in civilian communities. "We send our service members to defend democracy abroad, then some of them face discrimination when they return home," he explained. "This case represents a broader pattern of how military service, particularly by minorities, is honored in abstract, but disrespected in practice." But it was Mrs. Grace Okafor who provided the most powerful testimony, speaking with the authority of someone who had experienced both the promise and the betrayal of the American dream. At 73, she had flown in from Atlanta with 3 of her grandchildren, wanting them to witness what she called a moment when America remembered its values. "My family came to this country with nothing but hope," she said, her Nigerian accent lending gravity to her words. "We believed that in America, if you worked hard and followed the rules, you would be accepted. My husband worked 3 jobs to buy our home in Willowbrook Commons. We thought we had achieved the American dream." Mrs. Okafor's testimony revealed the full extent of the harassment her family had endured. Karen Mitchell had questioned their right to have extended family visit during holidays, claiming that too many cars in their driveway violated community standards. She had complained about their traditional cooking during family gatherings, describing the aromas as foreign odors that affect property values. "She made our grandchildren feel ashamed of our culture," Mrs. Okafor said, her voice breaking with emotion. "These beautiful children born in America began asking us not to cook our traditional foods when they visited. An 8-year-old child should never have to choose between their heritage and their neighborhood acceptance." The most painful detail involved Karen's treatment of their son, Dr. Michael Okafor, during his visits home from his medical residency in Detroit. "Karen actually called the police on my son when he was wearing his white coat, claiming an unlicensed person was providing medical services in the community. My son, who graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School, who saves lives in Detroit's emergency rooms, was treated like a criminal for visiting his parents." Mrs. Okafor's words hung in the morning air as she continued. "But today we see the other side of America, the side that stands up for justice, that honors service, that refuses to accept discrimination disguised as community standards. Today, America shows its true character. The assembled crowd included residents from 12 different HOA communities where similar discrimination patterns had been documented. Each community had sent representatives to share their experiences and show solidarity with General Washington and the other victims. Carmen Valdez from Fairfax Meadows spoke about the network of harassment that had targeted Latino families across multiple communities. "We thought we were alone," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We thought it was just one racist person making our lives difficult. Now we understand it was an organized system designed to exclude families like ours from communities we had earned the right to call home." Carmen's testimony revealed the sophisticated nature of the discrimination network. They had templates, she explained. The same violation letters, the same escalation patterns, the same pressure tactics used across multiple communities. It wasn't random prejudice. It was systematic exclusion designed to look legal. The Nguyen family from Heritage Oaks shared their story of harassment over their teenage daughter's piano teaching, which had been characterized as an illegal business operation. "Our daughter Linda was sharing her musical gifts with neighborhood children," Mr. Nguyen explained, his arm around his wife and daughter. "She was building bridges between families, creating exactly the kind of community connections that make neighborhoods stronger. Instead, we were treated like criminals." 16-year-old Linda Nguyen stepped to the microphone with the poise of someone who had learned hard lessons about adult prejudice. "I started giving piano lessons to help save for college," she said. "The kids I taught were my friends, my neighbors. Their parents appreciated having music education close to home, but Mrs. Mitchell treated my lessons like I was running a crack house." Linda's testimony struck a particular chord with the assembled crowd because it highlighted how discrimination affects children and their dreams. "I almost gave up music entirely," she admitted. "I thought maybe if I made myself smaller, quieter, more invisible, the harassment would stop. But this week taught me that making yourself smaller never stops bullies. It only encourages them." As each family testified, a pattern emerged that went beyond individual instances of discrimination. The evidence revealed a systematic approach to what housing advocates called economic ethnic cleansing, using legal and financial pressure to force minority families from upscale communities. Housing attorney Maria Santos presented statistical analysis that had been compiled during the federal investigation. "The data shows clear intent to discriminate," she explained, pointing to charts displayed on large screens. "Minority families received violations at 3.7 times the rate of white families. They were charged higher fines for identical violations. Their appeals were denied at significantly higher rates even when presenting identical evidence. The financial analysis was particularly damaging. The Mitchell Network generated over $340,000 in legal fees from discriminatory enforcement actions," Santos continued. "They created problems, charged the communities to solve the problems they created, then profited from property acquisitions when families were forced to sell." FBI Special Agent Jennifer Martinez stepped to the podium to announce the results of the federal investigation that had consumed the past week. The evidence collected in this case reveals a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used homeowners association enforcement as a cover for systematic housing discrimination and financial fraud, she said, her words carrying the weight of federal authority. "We have documented over 200 instances of discriminatory enforcement across 12 communities, resulting in the forced relocation of 47 families and the illegal acquisition of properties worth approximately $3.2 million. Agent Martinez continued. "This investigation has revealed one of the largest housing discrimination schemes prosecuted under federal law in the past decade. The criminal charges announced that morning were extensive and devastating. Karen Mitchell faced federal charges including conspiracy to violate civil rights, mail fraud, wire fraud, and racketeering under the RICO statute. Bradley Mitchell faced additional charges related to money laundering, professional misconduct, and using his law practice to facilitate criminal activity. The broader network faced sweeping charges. 16 other individuals connected to the scheme faced various federal and state charges, including property managers, security contractors, and business associates who had participated in the discriminatory enforcement and financial fraud. Agent Martinez announced that the FBI was expanding the investigation to examine similar patterns in other states, based on tips received from across the country. This case has revealed methods of discrimination that may be replicated in other communities, she explained. We are committed to ensuring that this kind of systematic civil rights violation cannot continue anywhere in America. But the legal consequences were only part of the story. Virginia Attorney General Sarah Johnson announced comprehensive reforms to HOA oversight and enforcement that would serve as a model for other states. No American family should face the choice between their home and their dignity, she declared. The reforms we're implementing today will ensure that HOA enforcement serves community building, not community division. The reforms were extensive and immediate. They included mandatory discrimination training for HOA board members, independent oversight of violation patterns, financial transparency requirements, whistleblower protections for residents reporting discriminatory enforcement, and criminal penalties for using HOA authority to facilitate discrimination. We are also establishing a state database to track HOA violations across communities, Johnson continued. This will allow us to identify discriminatory patterns before they destroy families and communities. General Washington finally stepped to the podium, and the crowd fell into complete silence. Even the media crews stopped their background chatter, recognizing that they were about to witness a historic moment. 40 years ago, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, General Washington began, his voice carrying the same command authority that had guided soldiers through combat operations across 3 decades of American military engagement. 40 years ago, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, General Washington began, his voice carrying the same command authority that had guided soldiers through combat operations across 3 decades of American military engagement. That oath didn't end when I retired from active duty. It guides me every day as I live in the communities I spent my career protecting. He paused, looking out over the assembled crowd with the same measured assessment he had brought to military briefings in war zones around the world. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle rustling of American flags distributed by the American Legion volunteers. The discrimination that occurred here wasn't just an attack on me or on the other families who faced similar treatment. It was an attack on the fundamental American principle that a person's worth is measured by their character and contributions, not by their race or background. General Washington's speech grew more personal as he continued. My wife Margaret and I chose to serve this country because we believed in its promise of equality and justice. She died believing that promise was real, that the sacrifices we made together had helped build a better America for all families. The events of this past week tested that faith. The mention of his late wife brought visible emotion to the general's face, a crack in the composed military bearing that made him suddenly, powerfully human. In the crowd, several people wiped away tears as they understood the depth of loss that had brought him to this community in search of peace. But today, I see the America Margaret believed in, General Washington continued, his voice strengthening with renewed conviction. I see neighbors standing up for neighbors, citizens demanding justice, and institutions responding to defend the rights of all Americans. This is the America we serve to protect. He turned to address the media directly, understanding that his words would reach far beyond Willowbrook Commons. To those who will report this story, understand that it's not about one incident in one community. It's about the ongoing struggle to fulfill America's promise of equality. Every family that suffered discrimination here showed courage by refusing to accept injustice as normal. General Washington's closing words carried the weight of 4 decades in uniform. Service to country doesn't end with military retirement. It continues when we stand up for our neighbors, when we refuse to accept discrimination, and when we demand that our communities live up to American values. Today, this community chose to serve those values. As he stepped away from the podium, something extraordinary happened. The 3 police officers who had responded to Karen's original call, Martinez, Johnson, and Walker, stepped forward and saluted their former commanding officer once again. But this time, they were joined by the entire honor guard of veterans, then by active duty service members in the crowd, and finally by civilians who understood they were witnessing a moment of redemption. The sustained applause that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes, punctuated by chants of "Thank you, General," and "Welcome home." Tommy Rodriguez broke from his father's grip and ran to present General Washington with a drawing he had made during the week, a picture of the 3 police officers saluting by the pool, with "My hero lives here" written in crayon across the top. As the formal ceremony concluded, General Washington made his way through the crowd, accepting handshakes and quiet words of appreciation. But he consistently redirected attention to the other victims of discrimination, ensuring that their stories weren't overshadowed by his own. 3 months later, Willowbrook Commons had transformed into something approaching the inclusive community its original marketing materials had promised. Karen Mitchell was serving 18 months in federal prison, while Bradley faced a 3-year sentence for his role in the financial fraud scheme. Their business network had been dismantled, with millions of dollars in restitution ordered for affected families. The Okafor family had decided to move back to Willowbrook Commons, purchasing a larger unit to accommodate their growing family of grandchildren. Mrs. Grace Okafor had become an informal community elder, organizing cultural celebrations that brought neighbors together rather than driving them apart. Dr. Aisha Patel had been elected to the HOA board, bringing medical precision to community management and ensuring that enforcement policies were applied fairly across all residents. Professor David Kim had started a neighborhood education cooperative, offering tutoring and enrichment programs that celebrated the diverse academic expertise within the community. The changes extended beyond individual families. New HOA bylaws required board training on fair housing law and cultural competency. Violation procedures included mandatory review by independent arbitrators to prevent discriminatory enforcement. Financial transparency requirements ensured that community funds served community interests rather than personal enrichment. But perhaps the most significant change was in the community's daily rhythm. Where once residents had avoided eye contact and hurried past each other with suburban politeness, genuine relationships had begun to form. Children played together across cultural lines. Families shared meals and celebrations. The pool area had become a gathering place where neighbors actually got to know each other. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 6 months after the incident, General Washington followed his usual routine, arriving at the pool at precisely 0600 hours for his 30 laps. But now he was rarely alone. Tommy Rodriguez often joined him for swimming lessons before school. Mrs. Carter practiced her own therapeutic exercises in the shallow end. Other early-rising residents had begun incorporating the pool into their morning routines. As General Washington completed his laps and prepared to return to Unit 4B, Tommy Rodriguez called out from the pool's edge, "General Washington, my dad says you're moving to a bigger house. Is that true?" General Washington toweled off with the same methodical precision he brought to all activities. "Tommy, I've decided to stay right here in 4B. This community has become home in a way I didn't expect." "Because of all the attention?" Tommy asked with the directness of childhood. "No, son, because of all the neighbors." The simple exchange captured something profound about what had transpired. General Washington hadn't just defended his right to live in Willowbrook Commons, he had helped transform it into a place where all residents could truly belong. Later that morning, as General Washington prepared breakfast in his kitchen, he noticed a handwritten note that had been slipped under his door. It was from Linda Nguyen, the teenager whose piano lessons had been targeted for harassment. "Dear General Washington," the note read, "thank you for showing us that standing up for what's right is more important than standing down to avoid trouble. I'm starting college music education next fall because this experience taught me that sharing your gifts with others is always worth the struggle. I hope to serve my community with the same honor you showed us." General Washington carefully folded the note and placed it in a small wooden box where he kept his most meaningful correspondence. The box also held letters from soldiers he had commanded, commendations from military leadership, and now testimonials from civilians whose lives had been touched by his quiet courage. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Willowbrook Commons, General Washington sat on his small balcony and watched families preparing dinner, children playing in the courtyard, and neighbors greeting each other with genuine warmth. The community had found something it had been missing: the understanding that diversity of background and experience strengthens rather than threatens the bonds that hold neighborhoods together. The story of Willowbrook Commons had become a case study taught in law schools, business programs, and public administration courses across the country. But for the residents who lived through the transformation, it remained simply the story of how a community remembered its values. As the sun set over Virginia, General James Washington closed his eyes and felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death: the deep peace that comes from knowing you're truly home, surrounded by neighbors who see your humanity before your differences, in a community that lives up to the ideals he had spent 40 years defending. Subscribe to see more stories of everyday heroes whose quiet courage transforms communities. Share your own experiences with housing discrimination in the comments. Together, we can ensure that every American family finds welcome in the neighborhoods they call home.